Well, thank you for being here with us. And we are very much looking forward to listening to your presentation on reimagining the ordinary, social inclusion through semiotics. And congratulations on your RC25 ISA award and on an excellent article that we recommend for everyone to read on the website of Language, Discourse and Society Journal, published by ISA RC25. So over to you, the floor is yours. Please let us know what you prepared for us.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much for this lovely award. It was really quite unexpected. And thank you also, everyone, for taking time to listen to this virtual presentation. I wish that I could be there in person. So today, I just want to give a brief kind of, I suppose, not exactly a research talk as such, but more of a provocation for thinking about how we can support social inclusion of children and young people with intellectual and developmental disabilities by reimagining what the ordinary itself means. Now, I have to be honest, I don't actually do research on young people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, but I do work with young people who are marginalized in other ways, socioeconomically, in terms of their gender expression, in terms of the locale in which they live. I work in Japan, particularly now in rural Japan. So the young people that I'm working with are not marginalized because they have particular disabilities, but rather because they're peripheralized from core social practices in Japanese life. And so I want to use this talk really to just think through what the ordinary itself means and how we can do research in ways that contributes to the reimagination of ordinariness itself. So it's important to keep in mind how much of what counts as ordinary is negotiated. So much research has shown that ordinariness functions as a mediator, which is to say it's a way of thinking through different kind of life ways. Certain life ways are deemed to be ordinary and certain life ways are deemed to be not ordinary. They can be extraordinary, so they're seen as somehow superlative with respect to a norm. They can be deemed as not ordinary, though negatively, as though there was an ordinary life way and someone has failed to live up to that standard. And because ordinariness is a mediator, it's a mediator that has to be negotiated. And so I do research more on the language side of social life. So it can be negotiated in interactions as a form of semiosis, which is to say it's negotiated at the level in small moments of speech, in small moments of practice, where it functions as a way to make social meaning. Ordinariness is also a complex network. And by complex network, I mean here that it's a complex of alignments, of negotiations, and of politicizations, because what counts as ordinary is often a political question. That is to say, ordinary for whom, ordinary in what way, ordinary with respect to what kind of standard. And as a political, negotiated, complex social aspects of life, ordinariness is always fluctuating and unstable. And it seems to me that we can capitalize particularly on this last aspect of ordinariness to think through how determining what counts as ordinary is a kind of micropolitics. It's a micropolitics that individuals in the communities that we study engage in. And it's also the kind of micropolitics that we as researchers can also think about because we are attending to certain aspects of social life. So the importance of attending to the ordinary is reflected in the fact that the ordinary is the site of negotiation, as I briefly discussed, but it's often treated as invisible, right? So many people have pointed out that the part of the power of ordinariness is the fact that it doesn't have to prove itself, right? It doesn't have to stand out. It doesn't have to stand alone. And what I want to think through a little bit more from now is how turning to the ordinary, how labeling something as ordinary, and how in some cases aspiring to the ordinary can be a form of endurance and resilience. That is to say, In the research that I do, for example, the younger adults that I look at, again, younger adults who are marginalized in different ways than those with developmental or intellectual disabilities, but those who are nonetheless marginalized as a result of socioeconomic facts or other social facts, they turn to an aspirational ordinariness as a way to get through the difficulties of daily life. And in that regard, the ordinariness functions for them as a tactical tool for indirectly resisting hegemonic imperatives. What this means is that for many individuals, to label something as ordinary is a way of resisting what counts as ordinary in a hegemonic sense. That is to say, I make something ordinary by appealing to ordinariness as part of my form of life, my life way, the embodiment that I have in the world. And in that sense, I am subtly transforming the meaning of ordinariness itself and doing some kind of political work. So a lot of researchers have looked at the way in which ordinariness is linked to transformation and to endurance. The two that I would perhaps call attention to are Veena Das, who has looked at the ordinary as transformative. Veena Das's research is focused on communities in India, post-partition communities that suffered significant amounts of violence during partition. And in that sense, what Das is looking to is what happens after ordinariness is lost, right? How do we get back to a state of ordinariness? And for Das, this means the birthing of an eventual everyday from the actual everyday. So for Veena Das, ordinariness functions as a kind of prefiguration. I look to a new form of ordinariness that is not necessarily part of my actual everyday ordinariness. For Elizabeth Povinelli, who's done a lot of research with Native communities, Indigenous communities in Northern Territories of Australia, ordinariness functions as endurance. So Elizabeth writes, rather than trying to become otherwise, which is to say, rather than trying to grow or to be more than what we are now, we are trying to be the same, and this is enough for us. So here, ordinariness is understood as the continuation of what we have now, that the endurance of the everyday into the future functions as its own form of achievement. And it's important to keep in mind that these are not contradictory. Endurance can become a form of transformation because it changes the terms of the debate of what counts as a good or desirable life. If the continuation of today functions as a form of desirable life, we're actually pushing back against a whole host of hegemonic pressures towards growth, towards change, capitalist pressures, imaginations, perhaps for those of you who are more closely involved with younger adults in terms of their social exclusion, thinking about what it means to develop. Right? What do we describe as a developmental disability? What does it mean to develop at all? What are the standards through which we imagine intellectual growth? Why is growth seen as so central to this imagination of a successful life? And because I do research in language, I'm going to be primarily looking at things in their linguistic aspects. So Harvey Sachs has argued that ordinariness is what one does to show that one is ordinary. So in a sense, one can make oneself ordinary by doing ordinariness. Ordinariness is not necessarily a state, it's a practice that has to be continually engaged in. It has to be repeated. It is a performance in that regard. At the same time, and again, with respect to language, the appeal to ordinariness. So, for example, to label something ordinary in language can be a form of negotiation of challenging life circumstances. So Yoshiko Matsumoto has coined this term quotidian frame to describe how older individuals who are facing really severe traumas related to the death of a spouse or to the loss of mobility often reframe how they're describing these quite challenging circumstances in terms of ordinary aspects of life. So one of the examples that Matsumoto often gives is an older woman describing the death of her husband as though he were taking a nap, and then adding on, oh, you know, he was always the kind of person to just be falling asleep at every opportunity, right? So reframing something that was quite traumatic as something that occurred within the confines of an ordinary life. And in that sense, doing a kind of work to reimagine what trauma actually looks like, how trauma is dealt with. And in the research that I particularly do, which is with younger adults in Japan and Korea, the ordinariness I define as the humble and seemingly uneventful, here again working off of Das and Povinelli. And I define ordinariness as a kind of desire, which I think might also be a way to help think through what it means to look for social inclusion strategies among certain kinds of marginalized younger adults. I think of desire as quite important because alignments towards broad social discourses can tell us about the shape of the world and its limitations and exclusions. What we want tells us about what we imagine as possible and what we don't imagine as at all in existence. So linguistically enacted desire in Japanese might be, for example, yaritai koto, the things that I want to do, which younger adults often use to describe the imagination of their future possibilities, what those possibilities look like, and also what is seen as not possible. Also things that are labeled as tanoshi, so fun things, things that are described positively. So now I'm just going to turn to two short examples from my own research, which again have to do with younger adults who are not excluded from social life because of intellectual or developmental disabilities, but because of socioeconomic or geographic facts. So for one example to think through comes from a young actor, Takeru Sato's a relatively famous actor actually, who describes the changes in younger adults that he knows, particularly younger adults who he knows who are not as successful as he is. And he describes that there is a change in what younger adults want out of a desirable life. And he says, what is important is the happiness of, was repeated there, going to Chiba with friends for a one-night, two-day barbecue. What is becoming popular with young people are values like the relationships with people close to one and the importance of small happinesses. We don't think things like tomorrow will be better than today. And then he kind of switches to talk about younger adults generally, they don't hope for things like the rebirth of the Japanese economy. So what he's arguing is that younger adults who are in many ways facing a severe set of social and economic challenges in Japan are redefining what counts as an ordinary life, rather than focusing on things like a full-time job, marriage, and home ownership. They're focusing on everyday happinesses, on local as opposed to, more broadly spread out geographic relations, and on the personal, right? So the happiness of going to Chiba for a one-night, two-day barbecue, right? So that's like everyday happiness that doesn't actually require a great deal of economic investment. Relationships with people that are close to you. So those are people who are close to you in terms of your geography, but also emotionally. So rather than expanding one social network, focusing on a smaller sense of social network, and on the importance of small happinesses, which is, a sense of personal happiness. So here you have a change in the mindset of what counts as a good life. And it's a life that is turned towards ordinariness as a limit, in a sense, right? This is the limit of our aspiration. But ordinariness can also function as a way to navigate exclusion and marginalization more broadly. And here I want to look through more carefully the use of ordinary itself. So the term ordinary, futsu in Japanese, for this young woman in her 20s who's describing how difficult her life is at the moment and how she is reimagining ordinariness in light of her present circumstances and is different to the circumstances of her parents' generation. So she says, during the night, to be able to sleep putsuni, ordinarily, without sleeping pills, is the goal that she wants to, one of the goals that she has. She then claims that she was born into an ordinary, a futsuna, salaryman household. So salarymen are white-collar workers, and they constitute what would be considered the broader middle and upper middle class in Japan. And while I hated my ordinary self, right, I was enchanted by the ordinary. So she both sees ordinariness as a trap and as something that she longs for. And then says, even though there isn't a definition of ordinary, is there? And the ordinary changes. I wonder what ordinary life is under these circumstances. And then as a sort of like thinking through what is her imagination of this ordinary desirable life, if I'm able to trust in this in order to, trust in a kind of continuation of life and have peace, maybe that only is good. So here, futsu, ordinariness, functions as a site of significant negotiation, right? It's something that this young woman longs for. It's something that she previously rejected. So she sees both the normative pressures of ordinariness and ordinariness as a site of desire. But at the end of the day, what she's longing for is a reimagined ordinariness, right? Not the ordinariness of her salaryman household, the salaryman household that she grew up in, but rather an imagination of ordinariness where she is able to trust in this day and have peace, right? Trust in the moment as it is and have peace, where the idea of anshin, right, safety and peace, suggests potentially the continuation of this trust into the future. So what can this tell us? So I think in terms of doing research on younger adults, we can think about how to focus on the small and on the everyday. Rather than looking always towards broad social changes, we can think about how younger adults imagine their lives in the moment. We can attend to the possibilities for making things ordinary as a tactic of inclusion, right? Including younger adults who have intellectual and developmental disabilities in the act of ordinariness actually reimagines the possibilities of ordinariness itself, and thus, I believe, works to further the task of social inclusion for younger adults, regardless of their developmental abilities or disabilities, because so many younger adults are now feeling so marginalized from so many aspects of social life. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This was Dr. Judit Kroo from Arizona State University. Thank you for joining us today in Warsaw.